Hello. We are making a video for you in the afternoon. And it's a wonderful day today. The sun is shining. And I want to talk about Anneliese and Eduard in this video. Story time, real story, true stories, and hopefully some inspiration for people and some good advice on health and healing and mind and psychology. So Anneliese and Eduard, they were a couple. I'm not showing you. They were a couple in Germany. Eduard was a politician in my hometown. He was also an engineer and a professor at the university. He was teaching engineering and math, and he was in politics. He was a diplomat, and his wife Anneliese was my childhood therapist. She was a Freudian school psychoanalytical therapist and psychologist, and my parents sent me to her. So let me just get started from as far back as I can remember and recall this. My dad studied architecture. He also had to take classes in math and other things at the university. And there was Eduard Pestel, his math professor, and they had become friends. Also long after he had graduated and become an architect and done his dissertation and all of that. They were friends, and Eduard is an angel soul and Anneliese is too. Okay. They are both all the way back at the Horsehead Nebula. I'm just guessing now. So Eduard died in 1986, I believe, somewhere around there, 1987, somewhere around there, when J.J. Krishnamurti died also. And Anneliese, she died in 2017, in the very beginning of January 2017, or at the very end of December of 2016. So they're back together and they're happy, and then they came back for a while as Labrador retrievers. So that was really amazing for me to see that. So people are already clicking this video off by now, but that doesn't matter. I'm not a hussy, hustler, pushover, people pleaser. I don't tell you what your ego wants to hear. Okay, I tell you what's in my artistic and autistic brain. So, but I have psychic abilities. I can see things. I can sometimes see people's entire soul and the soul development and what the soul is doing here in this existence. And there are past incarnations that maybe I have glimpses into their future incarnations or into the intentions of their souls for future incarnations. The future is never written in concrete. That can change all the time. I just see what kind of path someone is on, energetically or physically, and then we can make some extrapolations on how their path is unfolding. But you can always, with your willpower, or with your mental willpower, or with your soul willpower, you can always make an adjustment, and you can always say, oh no, I changed my mind, I'm going to do something differently in my next incarnation. So, or I will become this animal or that person. So, yeah, they came back as Labradors, and both of them were adopted from completely different places. That's how the soul works, soul contract. We find our ways back, and without any effort. If there is any effort involved, that effort will actually block that flow of things that are lined up and that are unfolding for a person. So if we're making any efforts into it, or any kind of thoughts and any kind of complicated stuff, so we need to flow with things. Always really contemplate, allow, and flow with things. Very important also what Esther Hicks said. So it is very important. Flow with the movement of things that are unfolding for you. You can make your life better consciously, of course, but there should never be any kind of strife involved. So that's very, very important to mention this. When there's any kind of struggle or strife or some kind of fight or some kind, when people say, I fight for this country. I mean, it's an old saying and all of this, and I'm okay with this. It's just that it is not the best wording of all, because when there's a fight involved, then the person will stand in their own ways to accomplish certain desired goals. Okay, so you can't be fighting, you can't be using force on anything, you just flow with what happens. Okay, and the Buddhists know that very well. So they always say, oh, someone ended up in a hospital with some maybe a broken bone, and they will say, the ego will say, why me, and why is this happening? But the Buddhists say, if you meditate on it, you see the larger picture of it. Maybe this broken bone saved you from being drafted into the military and ending up in Afghanistan or Iraq, where you would have been shot dead. So maybe this lifetime has more for you to learn and grow with, okay, other than going to war for the oil industry, right? So that's pretty obvious. But, things unfold in this way. If you let it unfold, you can cry with something that happens, that's flowing, but don't be fighting against it. Don't be in resistance, mentally or physically in any way, okay? So, very important. So the two souls, Anneliese and Eduard, they came back as Labradors, living with a wonderful angel soul woman who rescued them, and they were happy ever after. So this is a wonderful fairy tale ending, because Anneliese, for the last couple of years in her Anneliese existence, suffered so much from grief for Eduard. She had flowers on the piano every day. She had this huge, humongous piano with a wing that was so shiny, and every day she would put flowers on that piano. My friend Birgit also Angel thought Birgit kind of was annoyed about it. Well, that doesn't give Eduard anything to constantly buy cut off flowers and stuff like this. But that's what she needed to do in that moment. That was her way of dealing with the grief and all of that. So, and she would always cry and say, "Come back, come back." And I understand that so well. I understand that with Kenny and the Papa dog. I understand that so well. So, and then she did primal therapy. Then I followed her to LA. We did primal therapy together. And she and Birgit went back to Germany for Birgit to be with her grandchildren and to live with Anneliese for about a year. That didn't go so well, but people have different ways of coping with their mental illness, and sometimes we step on each other's toes, and then we have to recognize that and know, okay, so that doesn't work out, I have to move on. And all of this is our soul school, of course. I stayed in LA. I continued with primal therapy. Then I went back to Germany also for 2 years. Then I went back to LA because it didn't work out with my parents. I went on my parents' nerves, and the study program didn't work out because I was still too depressed, and I had this extreme anxiety of giving presentations, so I had to go back to LA to do primal therapy. Then I met Paul. So that's like the timeline of all of this. And it was very difficult for Anneliese, losing Eduard. Very, very, very difficult. And he knew this. He was very worried for her. He always said Herze, he called her, which means heart. I am worried about you. What's gonna come about you, after he leaves that existence and takes his Earthian spacesuit off. He had leukemia and died from that. And I wanted to get into this yesterday in my video. And I thought I'm gonna make an entire video dedicating that to Eduard and Anneliese. And it's all tragic, but it is all soul school, and this is just how we learn certain things. Okay, there is no grudge, there is no blame shifting, any of that. If we do blame shifting, I understand where people come from when they do it, but it doesn't move them forward in any way. It just causes more problems. It causes more learned helplessness, and then saying, oh, they did that to me, or this has happened, or because of that struggle. But we have to remember one thing is very important. Any struggle or fight requires two parties, two people, okay? It requires two entities in order to struggle with each other. Sometimes you struggle with yourself too, that happens too. But that is because you are, and the German word portrays that very well, Verzweiflung. You are psychologically split in two. And the Buddhists talk about this, like splitting off with your consciousness. Some people split off into more than two fragments, into many fragments and many personalities and many thought personalities that could be still in one personality. That could sometimes it's all a fragmentation process, and it is splitting away from consciousness. So that could be you're still aware about it. That could be also where you're not aware about it anymore, and you're splitting off in two different people. Anneliese had that pretty much going, and my mother has it going. So I see two personalities that split off. Okay, one personality comes out in a very specific situation, and the other one goes into unconsciousness, and then the other one comes back when the situation has changed. And so that can happen where the person is not even consciously aware, and that's also very tragic, because it is a form of denial and anosognosia. When that happens, all of this is split consciousness, and these are coping mechanisms, but they are not beneficial when we're dealing with our loved ones, or in any kind of, when we communicate, when we live with someone, and then someone just basically cops out into a different personality. That is not sticking with truth, That's not sticking with reality. That's not dealing with reality. But these mechanisms can become very automated and very unconscious. So they can come out of unconsciousness. That's why it's important that we introspect, that we are radically honest with ourselves, and that's not easy for everyone. Okay, obviously, that's why I'm not blaming anyone from the higher perspective, but it is important that we become conscious about these things, so that we don't fall into those traps that our own minds are creating for ourselves. So, but the word Verzweiflung in German means I have split myself in two, and that really translates the direct, the meaning translation of that, the actual meaning translation of that word into English would be total despair. Okay, Verzweiflung, total despair. And maybe even the word despair comes from the splitting apart in two. Despair, I just thought about it right now. Pair. Like, I've become a pair, I've become two. De means from, so I'm coming from a two split mind state, sort of, So the word despair includes that as well. Verzweiflung is even more obvious with this. So fair means kind of like the process of total despair and splitting into two, like an inner war, an inner struggle that is going on. So whenever there is a struggle and a war, then we're not in this flowing process with the infinite, with our soul journey, and with the natural flow of nature. So we have to make our minds still, and we have to connect again with that inner artist and that inner child that we have. And then things are easy, then, as Jiddu Krishnamurti said, then whatever problem arises, it can be solved immediately. If we sit with it and let this flow, that means we can let it flow in tears, as I said yesterday and in many of my videos. Tears are good, okay? Don't force tears. Okay? They come and go as they want to, but allow them to flow. It's hard for a lot of men to do this because they have been told that they have to be tough and all of this, but that's propaganda. That's not the truth. That's not the field of truth. Okay, that's not how things should be. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you're a woman or a man. Okay, you can let your tears flow. Okay, you cried as a child, so when did you shut that up? Okay, open that up again and be that inner child. Be the artist, be that real person, be the natural person that you are, okay? Not the propaganda person that tries to please the father's neurosis, the father's ego, or society's egos. Okay, so just be that person that you actually are. Love the person you actually love. Feel compassion and feel empathy for another living being, and ignore that ego that says you need to be tough and you need to never show any kind of softness. So you need to become very aware. I guess maybe a few women have that too, but most women don't have that. They haven't been put under this social vice as men have. So, but it doesn't matter whether you're under a social vice or not. Undo all of that. Okay, it's up to you to undo it. If you want your body to relax, if you want your brain to relax, if you want to live a life of peace, you have to question society, and you have to undo all of that social damage that has been done to you, and the propaganda and all that brainwashing and the lies and the religion and all of that. Okay, undo all of that. Throw that in the recycling bin, okay, and come back to your senses as the real person, the natural person that you are. So Anneliese and Eduard, they lived a life together after having been rescued with that wonderful angel soul lady, and they were happy together. And that's a wonderful fairy tale ending. They were both boys, but the soul doesn't care, So the dogs were both boys, but the soul doesn't care, They were husband and wife as humans in their former lives. So it doesn't matter, we come together. We can come together in many different forms, okay, in our future incarnations, or we don't meet a certain person anymore, okay. I'm letting my mother go, her way. I love her, I send her love, so I wish her a good retirement. Now she is very ill, she doesn't want to live anymore. If it was up to me, I would talk to her about this every day. If she expresses the wish to die, a wish like this should be granted. If she changes her mind, then I will grant that as well. But I know that's not easy for my brother and my dad dealing with that situation. I don't blame them if they listen to the doctors, because they kind of feel helpless, So they listened to the doctor and they decided, okay, well, we're gonna do it this way. Okay. So, and that's okay, So sometimes they don't give extra medication for this or that, and let things then take its own course, rather than forcing the body with steroids or certain medications or kidney medications or whatever, to keep that organ running kind of artificially and unnaturally. So it's better to let it go the way it wants to go. But when a person says they don't want to live anymore, that should be granted. That's just my personal view on it, and that's also what the philosopher said. That's what Dr. David Benatar says, okay, so that people should have the right to die. It's very, very, very important. So, and a lot of people talk about this. Many, many, many people talk about this as well. So, yeah, so I'm sure they are no longer there now in the dog form, because the dog form doesn't stay very long in this existence. So, but they're somewhere at the Horsehead Nebula. They're together holding each other, and I have seen the most amazing things in those photos from Horsehead Nebula. Those are photos from the Hubble telescope and other very, very high-end telescopes around the world that are taking photos of different nebulae and star systems. So unbelievable what you see. Sometimes a photo will actually look like a real ancient oil painting from the Middle Ages, from 1600, like a painting from Raphael or Rubens and other great painters, Michelangelo, so Leonardo da Vinci, So sometimes it will have that character, not exactly like this word. You have this exact representation, but it has that character where you actually see these kind of people and animals floating there together, holding hands, morphing into each other, floating just like these Botticelli angels from the Botticelli frescoes in Italy, in old cathedrals on the ceiling. So it's pretty amazing what you see in those photographs. And I wonder if some of those painters actually had that inner stillness and went in their minds to those nebulas, just because they didn't have the telescopes at that time. They had to meditate into it. They had to do some soul journeying and out of body soul journeys to those places, or an inner envisioning of those places that they called heaven. So it's very amazing. So may they be in peace forever and ever and ever and ever. And I love them infinitely much, both of them. Amazing souls, angel souls. Anneliese rescued animals. They were on many ambassador, politically diplomatic missions and excursions around the globe, and she would accompany Eduard on many of those vacations and seen so many places, China, and talked to Chinese politicians and diplomats and India and many different places. And sometimes she would see, particularly in the third world countries, she would see an animal shackled up like a camel or horse, shackled up with ropes, and she would go there and cut that rope open with her pocket knife. No matter what, even if she goes to prison or if this is causing problems with those diplomatic conversations that Eduard was having. And Eduard was equally angel. They were during the Cold War. They were in Russia in a primate center. The Russians were showing Eduard with much pride, look what we have, a primate center. And these monkeys and apes were behind bars, and many of them looked really unhappy and Anneliese, in the middle of that guided tour, she would say, "I've had enough. This is cruelty to animals. I'm walking out of here." And Eduard, what he would do is, he would say, "My wife is right. I'm going with her. We are leaving." During the Cold War, when they were trying to do diplomatic talk. That is putting compassion over your social standing. It even puts compassion over some ridiculous political negotiations and diplomatic official type of formal formalities that are sometimes very superficial, actually. So, and they knew that, they were trying to make the best out of it and really be there for these people and listen and really make peace, offer that what they have to offer to make peace. But when it comes to a situation like that, they're in the middle of a primate center where there are apes behind bars because they're studying them, the neurologists and so on, and they're proud of that. Then they see the suffering, they say, "No way, not with our approval, okay? We don't approve of this, we don't accept this, we don't tolerate this. This is wrong," and they will say it right to these people's faces. Those are angel souls. Those are advanced souls. Those are people that walk their talk. Those are people that stand up for justice and peace and animal liberation and animal rights and animal personhood rights. Okay, I know they would both sign my petition, personhood rights for animals. They both would. They have actually fought for personhood rights for their dog. That's what they did when they were, I can't mention any localities, but they lived in a castle partition in Germany. That was a very old castle partition that belonged to a very large botanical garden, and he was given that house as an honorary present in form of a loan, not like given that real estate, but he was granted to live there for the rest of his life, and Anneliese too. So, by the city. I can't mention names because of his work as a diplomat, and he's done a lot of work to bring peace also between countries. A very amazing mind, Eduard Pestel. He co-wrote a book, very important book for the Club of Rome on overpopulation. People need to know that those people, Club of Rome, or those, maybe not all people in the Club of Rome, they are always infiltrators, right? But the Club of Rome was created in order to do good for the world. That was the original intention. And for Eduard, that was very serious, and he wanted to walk that talk for the Club of Rome, and he wanted to bring awareness back then about global warming and overpopulation, and he was 100% right, okay, with their calculations and their extrapolations that they have done for that book, together with another scientist, and he was involved with science as well, so particularly in the field of sociology and politics, and in order to make things better. And he would always end his talks at the university and wherever he was invited to give presentation, he would always end his talk by saying, But if we don't bring love back into the world, then all of this talking has no sense at all. It won't do us any good. We have to bring love and compassion back into the world. He would also say that in Israel, in presentations. So that's how courageous he was, okay? And they were members of a golf course, and they would go there to relax their minds, and they would bring their dog. They had a little dachshund, and that little dachshund is also in that book that she wrote about me when I was a child. She did a psychoanalytical therapy with me from 5 to 8 for a little over 2 years, and she would bring the dachshund into the therapy, and I would always identify myself with that dog. So I could talk about my worries kind of like in third person perspective, and in identifying myself with the dog, and I've always identified myself with dogs. So, and that made the therapy process easier for me. And sometimes Eduard would take care of the dog while she was in the therapy session with me. So they wouldn't leave the dog alone. And when they went to the golf course, they didn't want to leave the dog alone. When they came together, they would always bring the dog, the dachshund. Dachshund's name was Mücke, which translates to mosquito. A rough-haired dachshund, like a wire-haired type of dachshund. Dachshund with kinky hair, okay, and very sweet dog. And the dog got very old, like 26 or something. So they took very good care of that dog. And so the people at the golf course, the people were the managers. They were running the golf course. They said, I know you're a diplomat, you're a high-ranking person, but if I grant you that your dog can come here, then all of these other people will bring the dogs, and they will make poo-poo on the golf course, and then what? And then we can't even run the golf course. What are we going to do? So, and then Eduard said to that manager, he said, but you bring people here, right? But my dog is a person too. And then the manager said, okay, in that case, we are declaring Mücke a person. And they officially signed her into the golf membership, and made her a member of the golf club, and they could always bring the dog. And that was very sweet. So they're very much for personal rights for animals. Wonderful people. Okay. So yeah, so when I have to try, I'm going back and forth with the timeline, but my dad was friends with him, and so then by the time I was 5 years old, before my brother was born, I was a very problematic child. I had extreme rage attacks, and that's a form of autism, or it's one form of, that's a brain-wise high-functioning form of autism. So I have a fairly high IQ, 104 on the first test. Yeah, on the first test, that can be widened and stretched out by learning a little bit on how these tests are, the patterns of those IQ tests. So lots of people have done it. They brought it way up. You can, so that was just on the first test, and it was timed and everything on the internet. So I was quite astonished. 104, it's not bad, okay? It's still sort of average, but it's on the higher end of average. Let's put it this way. So the average IQ in Japan is what Paul said. Paul said 103, something like this. So if I'm one dot above the average IQ in Japan, that's not too bad, right? That's not too shabby. And one can always bring that up. So, and math is not my thing, so it was mainly math based, that IQ test. So, but also spatial vision and those kind of things, just logical type of multiple choice tests. So, but I have definitely Asperger's. I have every single point of that. When I was a child, it was very difficult. I don't know if this pertains to Asperger's alone, but I was definitely one of those kids that would go into unbelievable fits of rage. And I've seen programs then later on the internet, on YouTube. I've seen programs where they have to do very specific things. They have to confine the child with cushions, and the parent has to sit on the back of the child and make it comfortable for the child, but restrain the child from flaring the arms out or hitting their head on the ground. And that's what I did, and my mother did nothing to protect me at all. I would hit my head over and over and over on the ground. I would be tearing my hair out. So sending me to a child therapist, that was not like some kind of extravagant move, like, oh, we are so yuppie, we sent our child to a therapist. No, this was an emergency move for my parents. Otherwise, their egos wouldn't even allow, like, oh, my child mentally, oh no, but it was so right in their faces that they had no other choice other than to send me to a therapist. So my dad had Eduard for dinner over, and he would complain to him and say, my daughter Nikki is very difficult. She's screaming all the time, throwing her head on the ground. And Eduard said, oh, my wife Anneliese is a child therapist. Send her to her. She can start an entire program, entire therapy process for however any length of time. I went there twice a week. So my dad was very relieved when Eduard suggested that and said, thank you very much for telling me. We're gonna definitely consider this. We're gonna do this. They came over to meet with Anneliese with over 1,000 drawings that I had made of cut off hands and heads and goats biting children into their blood. What is that all about? So what kind of trauma have I already been through? My parents leaving me alone 2 times per year for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks with some aunts and people they didn't even trust. Nannies that were 16 years old that took me to wild hippie parties when I was 2 or 3, okay, where they drank alcohol and smoked marijuana, and the room was full of cigarette smoke, and I would be handed from one person's lap to the next, and who knows what they all did with me, Who knows what any of these people did with me. Some of this may have split away. It's a form of retrograde amnesia, okay? So also my grandfather, I don't trust him. I didn't trust him. I had disgust feelings towards him. Where does that come from? There was a guy named Carl that I was absolutely terrified of, a friend of my parents. So lots of shady people that went in and out of my parents' home, my grandfather's house. Nannies were coming and going that never worked out. It was quite dysfunctional, all of this, in spite of what my parents think of themselves as being so academic and liberal and all of this, but a notch too liberal, okay, for my taste, and a notch too anti-authoritarian for my taste. There was still no love involved. What good is the anti-authoritarianism if there is ice coldness and no love, and just a mother being annoyed of her child or being mad at her child and not helping the child, not restraining the child from hitting her head on the ground, okay, and tearing the hair out. And then one time I threatened my mother with a kitchen knife. That was like the pivotal point. That's when my dad opened up to Eduard about this. They did EEG tests. They came out normal. It was obviously psychological. So they sent me to Anneliese, and I started with the therapy process, and she wrote a book about it. The book is badly translated into English. I have to warn people about this. So, and I love the person. I know the person who translated the book. I love her. I sent her love. She didn't know better. That's just where she was at. And she wasn't also really, she wasn't very attuned also to my case. So it was a little laissez-faire, the whole thing. And a lot of typos and stuff left in the book. And I'm surprised that Spitter was even, the publisher was even published this. So that's not good enough of a translation. But I guess he knew Anneliese and he knew Eduard, and so, people that know each other, when you have great connections, that already paves the way and ignores a lot of problems. And that's not good. I don't like that. So I started to translate the book again, the original books in German, of course, and it's still on the market in Germany, in German. And it had been translated into many languages worldwide, even Chinese. It's amazing. And the book, it has been put into universities as a school literature. It is school literature, mandatory school literature in Germany, in high school, for high school graduations, in psychology, and so on. And that's very nice that they even made a film about it. So in Germany also, an actress played Anneliese, little girl played me. I've never watched the film, I've never seen the film, but I guess Anneliese told us the film wasn't very good, so we never got into it. Weirdly enough, I think I'm going to have to research this and watch the film now that I think about it. But she wrote a book about this, and the book is really, really absolutely brilliant. The German original version is brilliant. And so I started about 10-15 years, I started to take that book on and started to translate it into English. I wanted to really put my heart and soul into this, because that's what you have to do when you translate a book, whether that book is about you or someone else or something else. So, and particularly in this case where I know exactly what I felt at any given time, so I wanted to rule out any kind of misunderstanding and translate that book into English in the best way possible, so that people really get an idea on what was happening in my brain, particularly now that I'm an adult. Looking back on that time, I can I can explain this in detail, which I couldn't when I was younger, so particularly not when I was a teenager or in my 20s. I wouldn't have been able to reflect on it to that degree. So I had to be in my 40s to start this and really have a very accurate insight into the emotions and all of this. The video is getting very long. So that book is remarkable, and that's why it has been translated into so many languages. And that's why it is still on the market in Germany. It is one of the top-notch psychotherapy session books that are out there in the world. I would say the best, I would definitely say the best, unless I'm biased for Anneliese, but I have read many other books like Dibs and other books that are about a child therapy session, and also adult therapy session books that are out there like Sybil and other books. I forgot the name of the one book that lady wrote. That was pretty brilliant. But I would say Anneliese really poured her heart and soul into more. I would even at one notch more brilliant than the other ones. So really unbelievable. I mean, that was the real creation process. That was the total flow. She was in her elements when she was doing the therapy with me and when she was writing the book. And she would take notes after every session and go through those notes very meticulously and think about this and really dive into my psychology with this. And she could also identify herself to some degree with my suffering and all of that. And then during that therapy process, that's when she encountered my anger rage that was coming up. And before I first got into the anger rage, I told her at the Casper Theater, I took out the crocodile and I told her, she had this Casper Theater with all these hand puppets. But some of those were like made out of hard plastic materials, and the crocodile was made out of hard plastic materials with a clapping jaw. And I'll take that crocodile out always once in a while, and quite often actually, and that was my favorite toy. And I would say to her, and this crocodile, it has a big mouth and sharp teeth, but the crocodile is always nice, means always well, always nice, and you must always be nice to the crocodile, almost like some kind of premonition of what was to come in the therapy, that my anger was going to be surfacing. And the anger representative, the crocodile representative, symbolically representative for my anger. So, and the anger came out, and she, unlike my mother, she protected me from myself. She protected me with pillows and cushions, and she would always put a big, like an upholstery under me and protect me from hurting myself. And she saw the facial expression and she said she had never in her life seen a little child with such hateful rage expression in the face. She was worried. She didn't know what was going on there. She called her professor and he said, "This sounds to me like a primal scream. Why don't you read the book, The Primal Scream by Dr. Arthur Janov?" It had just come out onto the market, the first one. And the very first one in, I think, the original English version, she already spoke English because she was always back and forth between California and Germany, because Eduard was teaching here also at the university, part-time teaching. And so she read the book and she said, that's it. That's a primal scream. That's primal rage. Okay, this is original trauma that is surfacing. And she decided then and there that she is going to be studying under Dr. Arthur Janoff and become a primatherapist. And I mean, by the time the first time she went there, I think the first time she went to Dr. Arthur Janoff, she was, I think, in her late 40s. She started the program. She was actually 3 years older than Dr. Arthur Janoff. So, and she was already a completely established therapist, but she very much valued him and respected him and learned from him, and was one of the trainees off and on every time they went there, and she also underwent the therapy process, because that's part of the school, to go through your own emotions and be your own client and be their client. Be client and student at the same time, because it goes hand in hand. One thing cannot go without the other. So it's very important to do this, particularly as a student, as a trainee. You have to know firsthand what this is all about. And that was very important for her. She started that, I don't know if she started that after, I think right after the therapy with me was completed, or at least, she wouldn't call it completed, but she said, this is completed for now. She told my parents that when I go into puberty, that these things are going to flare up again. And they did. But at least I had a couple of years between childhood and puberty where I had somewhat some kind of peace of mind. Somewhat. Not completely, but I went to Waldorf school. I learned to play the wooden flute and the violin, and we did art crafting there, which is very, very good. I'm a big fan of Rudolf Steiner, and Anneliese too was, and it is, the entity is always there, the soul is always there. Okay, and yeah, and she helped me a lot in this therapy process. She helped me a lot to work my way through it. Even though, as a child, you can't do this very, very intellectual thought process and, the analytical thought processes and so on. With a child, just like with an animal, you guide that being through that flow of emotions. That's what you do with that process. And basically with an adult too, But with primatherapy, we start out with talking and talking and talking, but then sometimes we need to talk off a lot of steam, and then we go into the emotions, and the therapist will see where the emotions are located, and will ask questions where the therapist saw the emotions. So, but primatherapy is not the end all. Of course, it is work in process as well, just as. And Dr. Arthur Janoff knew that, and he wanted people to take that on and carry it on into the future. They had hope in a girl named Kirsten and me, and because we were the youngest, and Elsa, they had hope into Kirsten, Elsa, and me because we were the youngest of the trainees at that time. So the other people, they were all... Elsa was 3 years younger than me. Kirsten was 12 years or 13 years younger than me. I was 26 when I started there. So, and the other people were in their late 30s and up. So Anneliese was the oldest, and everyone was projecting their mother into her, and she was kind of annoyed about that. But Anneliese got a lot of help from this, and I got a lot of help from this, and many people did. But they also made mistakes, and 3 people died. 3 people died who were trainees and patients at the center, and that's very, very tragic. And I warned them particularly about Len. I warned them about him. I said there's something not right with him. I couldn't really say what it was. Later on I knew exactly what it was. He was a heroin addict. I felt like he was never really there mentally. So he was very, very intelligent and knew what this was all about, and he felt his pain. But he wasn't able to really dive into all the way he really needed, because he just buffered it up with the pain medicine, with the narcotics, and then eventually with heroin. And then he died from a heroin overdose. A friend of mine found him in his room. She was living with him at that time. Really tragic. I warned them. I said that he's not really quite there. Something is going on. I think he's taking narcotics. I think I said that he's taking narcotics because I always saw him at Thrifty's drugstore. He was always there with self-prescribed prescriptions, and he falsified his physician's signature. So, yeah, really tragic, all of this. And a friend of mine, Jana, committed suicide. That's infinitely sad. And who else? There were other people. Yeah, and then people in the past that died, and they weren't able to help them. But it's not always like this is the cause of this therapy, which Paul blames everything on the therapy. No, it's not necessarily always the root cause. Okay, the therapy, primotherapy, like blaming everything on primotherapy. No, it's a combination of things, and sometimes the therapists, they have pain themselves, and because of that they're not able to pay close attention all the time. But that's why this therapy process is extra delicate and has to be done very, very meticulous and very mindfully, okay, so that the therapists are always resolving their own emotions right up front. So that the therapist never goes into a session with a client when they themselves still have something going on that they are struggling with, in particular when their client is triggering these emotions. So that's when it becomes a disaster. Okay, so that should never ever happen. And that's why I think it's very important that the therapists are always disclosing their emotions, and that all of this is out in the open, that there's total transparency in emotions between anyone and everyone, and that this should not be separated into these are just the clients and these are the trainees. This is the trainee group, this is the client group. So this is where I come in with my own conclusions to make this process better, and I'm not going to call it primotherapy. So I will call it the inwardness meditation process, and that also incorporates other forms of therapy as well. It's very, very important that we don't have a lopsided approach with this, that we have group sessions every day from 5 to 8, very, very important, where everyone, the therapists also feel their pain, feel their emotions, the therapists talk about it to everyone else, and that there is no separation or hierarchy going on, because we're all living beings. We all have been traumatized. And one time there was this guy, Walter, from Switzerland. Walter was an artist, is an artist. I don't know if where Walter is now. So I lost touch with these people. But Walter from Switzerland, an artist who was living in Italy, and he came to the center, and he was, as a child, he was an orphan child, and he was handed from one foster care to another, a very traumatic childhood. And he was struggling with this a lot. He was talking about that in group therapy. Leslie was his therapist, and Leslie never disclosed to him what she had been through, something very similar as him. I guess she wanted to set herself above him or something, I guess, and that's an act out, okay? But she thought that's better for the client, but that's a misunderstanding, and that's completely wrong. It's false, it's wrong, it doesn't work. So he was really struggling, and she was triggered by Walter, I could see this. And I stood up and I said, Walter, Leslie was an orphan child too. And she was really mad at me for opening this up. And that was like, how dare you, it's none of your business to intercept like this. But guess what? It made Walter, it lifted 1,000 pounds off Walter's shoulders. What? Leslie, you've been through that same thing. Now I understand you better. Now I understand the whole thing. I understand why you're acting like this, and so on. Okay? So that fixed the problems between them, and the struggle and the trigger. And then when she's triggered, she can't help Walter, obviously. So these things have to be transparent and out in the open. This is very important. So yeah, that is the story, and now in the end, the video is very, very long. So I wanted to get to Eduard, and I've been talking now about therapy and Anneliese for most of the time, but I wanted to talk about Eduard, and very important man. I already talked some about him, about his courage and all of this, but I read his book, that he has co-authored with a scientist. They wrote together, and scientific book and everything, but he was weaving into that scientific book his religious beliefs, and these religious beliefs stood in direct contradiction to the scientific information that he was writing about. So at the end of that book, there were a couple of empty pages, and I just took a marker and I wrote down my notes on this, what I observed. And I think later on I also shared with Anneliese my thoughts on this, and that probably triggered her. I triggered her a lot, by the way, when I was an adult. So that's a constant triggering going on. But it is what it is, She triggered the hell out of me too. But later on, I could clearly see. I didn't know him that well in person. I've met him a few times, and he was always incredibly wonderful. But that book revealed more to me about him. That's why I wanted to read it very carefully. And I could also, from the telltales from Anneliese, so I put all of these pieces together in regards to Eduard, and particularly with the leukemia that he died from. And before I even read Clemens Kubi's health book, or other people's health books, or metaphysical or occult works from other people, I could tell that was pretty obvious, that the illness of leukemia is caused by a psychological conflict within the person. That brings me back to the word Verzweiflung, split apart inside of my own mind. So he was living in Verzweiflung in his head and didn't even know it. He was living a double life psychologically, between being a fundamentalist Christian who believed that abortion is murder, and then being a scientist, a global warming scientist, who says the danger of overpopulation is so severe that if we don't get pandemic outbreaks, we're going to have such tremendous suffering happening on this planet that people cannot even wrap their minds around it. And he wrote this in the early 80s. So those were scientific extrapolations into the future, and they are spot on. Okay, and we had a pandemic outbreak, but then the pharma industry and all of this, trying to put a cap on this again, of course. But pandemics have been the Earth's own immune systems. The pandemic is the immune system of planet Earth. The pandemic is the fever of planet Earth that gets rid of an overpopulation of a specific species. Okay, could also be animal species. There were animal species that also had pandemics, but the human in particular. Okay, so the human ape is capable of even out-tricking wars and all of that, particularly in the so-called civilized societies, where they have become somewhat compliant with each other without getting into too many wars. And then obviously they explode in numbers, and then things are getting very tricky, particularly in third world countries where people are starving and are suffering tremendously. Okay, so then pandemics happen as a form of the earth ridding itself from an overpopulation of a specific species. So and the way he wrote that also, and he said the pandemics will be necessary if we don't want to experience the extreme suffering. Now, that coming from a fundamental Christian, I mean, you would never hear any other fundamentalist Christian talk or write like this. So he was also a scientist. That was the scientist part of him. But then he would, in the next paragraph, he would weave in his own Christian contradiction to what he said before as the scientist, almost like in order to appease his conscience, his religious conscience, which is not equal to an empathetic conscience, to the natural conscience. So a religious conscience is coming from indoctrination. But he didn't know that. He wasn't aware of that. He just thought, I better weave in some of the religious stuff in order to, or, I will go to hell or whatever, which is a horrible threat. That religion is basically blackmailing and extortion. That's what they do with their followers, and Eduard was their victim. Okay, so, but he also had tremendous empathy too. So that didn't come from the religion. That also didn't come from the scientific part of his life. That came from his soul, the angel soul. So, and the courage, of course, as well, came from the angel soul, and the empathy, the real empathy for other living beings, for primates and camels and elephants and all the animals that they have come across during their travels. And their own dog, of course, is a person. So they take empathy and kindness and compassion very seriously. But here we see a man having been indoctrinated by the Christian fundamentalist evangelical church and being also a scientist at the same time, being a scholar, and trying to accommodate these things was impossible for him. So living this mental, psychological double life in his mind and in his body caused his own body to go against the body's own blood cells. Okay, so that's the leukemia. Okay, it's very severe, and I bet you every single leukemia case is rooted in such an inner Verzweiflung, an inner splitting apart, an inner tug of war in the brain, in the mind, in their psychology. This inner totally split fight and war that was going on. That was going on in Eduard, and that is going on in those people that develop such an immune deficiency where the body fights against their own cells. Okay, it's a horrific thing. That's a horrific suffering that these people go through. The medical industry with chemotherapy and toxic treatments and all of this just makes things worse. It doesn't help them heal at all. Just makes them suffer even more. They die anyway. Horrific suffering. And it doesn't even prolong their lives. Matter of fact, the people who don't do anything about it, they live on average a couple of months, if not half a year, or even more than half a year longer than their physician predicted it with the medication. So right there, some food for thought. This is very tragic, what happened to Eduard. That shouldn't happen to anyone, that shouldn't happen to any living being anywhere in the infinite cosmos, in the infinite universe. And that's a fact. And that's why I talk about this, and that's why I talk about holistic healing and how important, how vitally important it is to do the inwardness meditation process, to come clean with what we fear, what we are afraid of. You know, if you are afraid of hell, talk about it, question that religion, and go into the holistic path, holistic healing path, no matter what other people say. Okay, if you want to make your life better, if you want to heal, and if you want to help make the whole world heal and better, you start with you. That peace process, that healing process starts with every single individual. Okay, this is very, very important. Learn from Eduard. Learn from his message to the world. Okay, you guys take care. Peace.